It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a break from work and head out into the woods for a few days. I was 34 back then, working as a mechanic in a small shop in northern Georgia. My back was always sore, my hands were always dirty, and the noise of the garage never really left my head, even when I was at home. I needed to get away from the constant clanging, away from the fumes and grease, and especially away from my boss who was breathing down my neck all the time about deadlines. I didn't have much money, so I didn't go anywhere fancy. I just threw my tent and sleeping bag into the back of my old Dodge Dakota, filled up the cooler with some food and water, and drove 3 hours north into the Chattahoochee National Forest. I camped out there a few times before, and I liked that it wasn't too developed. No paved roads deeper in, no bathrooms, no cell service. That was the whole point. It was a Wednesday when I pulled off one of the service roads that cut through the trees. I didn't see another car for miles, which felt perfect. I followed an overgrown dirt track that looked barely used, parked near a wide clearing next to a little creek, and started setting up my tent beneath a stand of pines. The air smelled like sap and moss. No traffic noise, no voices, nothing but the steady hum of insects and the soft rush of the water nearby. I got the fire pit going early, just a simple one made from rocks I found around the clearing. Cooked a hot dog over it on a stick like I was a kid again. I stayed up till the fire burned down to glowing coals, and when it started to get chilly, I crawled into the tent and passed out. That first night was peaceful. I slept straight through till morning. Woke up to birds chirping and sun filtering through the fabric of the tent. I felt more rested than I had in months. I boiled some water for instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and spent the whole day exploring the woods around me. There was no trail, just wild growth, deer tracks, and the occasional sign of raccoons digging around. I even saw an old tree stand nailed to a tall oak, probably left behind by a hunter years ago. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire again, just poking at the wood with a stick and watching sparks pop into the dark. It was around 10 p.m., and I remember the wind had died down completely. That was the first thing that felt strange. Total stillness. The woods are never truly silent, but it was like someone had muted everything.
No crickets, no frogs.
Just the sound of the fire. Then I heard something out in the trees. It wasn't a branch snapping or an animal running through the brush. It was softer than that, more deliberate. Like footsteps, but not fast. Slow and steady. I froze, my hand gripping the stick. I listened hard, thinking maybe it was a deer or even a black bear. But it didn't move like a four-legged animal. It moved like a person. I waited and waited, but the sound stopped. I shined my flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing. I figured maybe I was just being paranoid. It's easy for the mind to play tricks when you're out there alone. Still, I didn't stay up much longer. Put out the fire and zipped up the tent. But I didn't sleep. All night I kept waking up to small sounds, like movement just outside the tent. Once I thought I heard breathing. Not the wind through the trees, not an animal sniffing around. Breathing. I stayed completely still, my heart racing, trying not to make a sound. But every time I peeked out with the flashlight, I saw nothing. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to sunlight again. I didn't feel rested. My neck hurt, and I was sweating even though it wasn't hot. I told myself I was just letting the isolation get to me. I thought about packing up, but I didn't want to be that guy who ran home because he got spooked by shadows. I stayed another day, hiked a little farther out, but I kept thinking about those footsteps. That third night is when it got worse. Around dusk, I spotted something across the creek. First, I thought it was a fallen tree, but it looked too smooth. It was a long, dark shape just past the water, barely visible between the trees. I stood there staring at it for maybe a minute before it moved. It was a person, a man, I think, wearing dark clothes, just standing there watching. I didn't wave or say anything. I just backed slowly into the trees on my side of the creek and circled around back to my tent. I waited behind a thick tree trunk for a long time, but when I looked back toward the water, he was gone. No sound.
No splash.
Just gone. I didn't make a fire that night. I kept everything dark. Sat in my tent with the flashlight off and the zipper half open so I could see out. I didn't sleep at all. At around 3 a.m., I saw him again. He was standing right at the edge of the clearing, near the trees, just standing there, like he had nowhere to be.
No flashlight. No gear.
Just standing there in the dark like he belonged out there. I didn't move. I stayed still for so long that my legs started to cramp up. I kept watching, waiting for him to leave, but he didn't. Then he started walking toward the tent. I felt like I was going to throw up. My whole body tensed. I wanted to grab something, anything to defend myself with, but I was afraid even the sound of my hand moving would give me away. He got within 10 feet of the tent, stopped, and tilted his head, like he was listening. Couldn't breathe. He stood there for a full minute, then turned and walked slowly back into the trees. I waited until dawn. I didn't sleep. As soon as the light came through the trees, I packed up everything I could carry in 5 minutes. I left the tent behind, left the cooler, left my folding chair, the food, the mess kit, everything. I just stuffed my sleeping bag and the flashlight into my backpack and ran to the truck. I drove all the way back to town in silence. Didn't even turn on the radio, just kept checking the rearview mirror like I expected to see him there, walking down the road after me. When I got home, I took a long shower, sat on my couch, and didn't say a word for hours. A week later, I went back with a friend to collect the stuff I left behind. We found the tent shredded, not ripped by an animal cut. Clean slices through the nylon, like someone had taken a knife and just gone to work on it. The cooler was gone. My chair was broken in half and thrown into the creek. We didn't stay long. We got what we could and left. I haven't gone camping since. Not once. I still live in Georgia. Still work on engines and transmissions every day. But I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't even go hiking. I don't know who that man was. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just some hermit, some unstable guy living off-grid. Maybe he was dangerous, maybe he wasn't. But I know one thing for sure, he knew I was out there. And he waited until the second night to show himself. That means he watched me for a whole day before doing anything. That's what sticks with me the most. My name is Eric Holt. This happened in 2016 when I was 32 years old. I had just taken a long break from work after quitting a job that had been grinding me down for years. I wasn't married, no kids, and didn't have anyone depending on me. I figured I had the freedom to disappear for a bit, just take some time alone to reset. So I packed my gear and went camping, but not in a national park or a common trail. I didn't want to run into people. I wanted somewhere quiet, maybe too quiet. I remembered an old quarry near a place called Weller Creek in upstate New York. I'd been there once when I was a teenager with some older cousins. It had been abandoned for decades. No security, no fences, just woods, cliffs, and forgotten machinery. I remembered the stillness of that place even back then. It had a weight to it. I drove up in mid-October, just before the weather turned bitter. Trees were still full but starting to shed. The forest roads weren't paved, just hard-packed dirt mixed with rock and clay. My Jeep handled them fine, but the further I drove, the more I realized I was deep in the middle of nowhere. No cell signal, no signs of anyone for miles, which at the time felt like a win. I reached the quarry around 2 p.m. The road ended in a clearing that looked like it had once been used for trucks to turn around. The cliffs of the quarry were high and uneven, maybe 40 feet in some parts. There was a still, stagnant pond near the middle that had probably filled over years of rainfall. Rusted equipment sat half swallowed by weeds and brush. The trees had crept in from every side, swallowing up the last signs that people had worked there. I picked a flat spot near the tree line with some old tire tracks that had almost faded away. I set up my tent, built a fire pit using broken rock, and unpacked everything I'd brought. I had enough food for 4 days, water, a small stove, first aid kit, and a hunting knife that I kept strapped to my hip, mostly out of habit. The first night was cold, but peaceful. The silence was total. No cars, no dogs barking, not even wind. Just the occasional crack of a branch deep in the woods. I thought it was perfect. The second day, I hiked around the edges of the quarry. I followed the rim to get a better view from above. There were trails, or what was left of them, running through the woods, probably old service roads. Most were blocked with fallen trees or too overgrown to follow. I kept exploring. About an hour into my walk, I found something strange. A rusted-out trailer sitting by itself under a thick canopy of oak trees. Its windows were busted out, and there were old tools scattered around it. One of the doors had caved in, and vines were growing through the broken floor. I didn't go inside. I didn't like the feel of it. I walked back to camp and didn't mention it to anyone. Not that there was anyone to tell. That night, I sat by the fire longer than usual. Something about that trailer kept itching in the back of my mind. I told myself it was just an old worker's shack, maybe left behind when the quarry shut down. But that didn't explain the weird burn marks on one of its sides, like something had scorched the metal in a way that didn't match a normal fire. By the third night, things felt different. The silence had changed. I noticed it right away. There were no birds anymore, no owls, no insects. Just the distant splash of water in the quarry pond now and then. I told myself it was the weather. Maybe a storm was coming, or the animals had moved on. Still, I kept my knife closer than usual that night. Slept with it inside the tent instead of leaving it strapped outside. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the lack of one. Total silence. Even the wind had stopped. I sat up and just listened. My breath sounded too loud in the tent. Then I heard something move near the tree line, soft but heavy. Not an animal. It didn't move like one. Stopped for a while, then moved again. I killed my flashlight. I didn't want to shine it right away. I wanted to hear more. Whatever it was, it didn't come closer. Just paced, slow and steady, maybe 30 feet out. Then it left. I waited another hour before I dared sleep again. When morning came, I looked around the edge of camp but didn't see any tracks. The dirt was hard, dry. Nothing to leave a mark, but I knew something had been there. My instincts wouldn't let it go. Still, I didn't leave. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I just needed rest. I spent most of that day walking the perimeter again, just moving, not thinking. I didn't go near the trailer this time. I stayed closer to the quarry edge. That night was colder. The fire barely gave off heat. I had it going high, burning through wood faster than usual just so I could feel something. And around 11 p.m., I started to hear something strange. It sounded like metal scraping, just once, far off toward the old trailer. I stared out into the dark trees, but the firelight didn't reach that far. I shut everything down, put the fire out early, and crawled into my tent. Didn't sleep much. I held the knife the whole night. At one point, maybe around 4 a.m., I heard what sounded like something dragging through the gravel, long, slow drags like something heavy was being pulled. I didn't unzip the tent. I just stayed still, listening. It stopped near my camp and sat quiet for almost 30 minutes. Then the dragging started again, moving away this time, toward the pond. When daylight came, I got out fast. I packed up everything in a rush. The tent barely folded right. I threw my bag in the Jeep and went to check where the sound had come from. Near the edge of camp, I found something that stopped me cold. There were fresh drag marks in the gravel, like something heavy had been pulled across the rocks. They were wide, deep, and trailed off into the woods. I followed them. Just a few feet into the trees, I found what looked like an old animal trap, half rusted and broken open. There was nothing in it, but next to it was a pair of rubber gloves, torn, caked with dirt, and one of them had dried blood on the fingers. I didn't go any further. I got in my Jeep and drove straight out, bouncing hard over the forest road. Didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror most of the way. A few weeks later, back home, I did some digging online. Not much ever came up about the Weller Creek Quarry, but I did find one small newspaper article from 1993. It mentioned a local man had been arrested for trespassing near the quarry after someone reported seeing fires and hearing screaming late at night. No charges were filed. They said it was a misunderstanding. But the man's name, I won't say it here, showed up again in a police blotter from 2004, this time for animal cruelty. He'd apparently disappeared before they could arrest him. I don't know if that man was still out there, or if it was someone else, but I'll never go back to that place again. The quarry might be abandoned, but I don't think I was alone out there. And whatever was there, it didn't want me to leave. It just didn't move fast enough. I was lucky. That was the last time I ever camped alone. It was October of 2014, and I was 33 years old when I decided to take a solo hunting trip into the woods outside Pendleton, Oregon. I had some time off work, and I needed a break from everything: emails, phone calls, people. I'd been hunting since I was a teenager, usually with my cousin or a buddy from the service. But this time I wanted to go alone. I wanted quiet, space, and the kind of stillness that only thick pine woods can give. I chose a remote patch of land near the edge of Umatilla National Forest, a place I'd been once before with a friend 2 years earlier. There was no formal campsite, just a patch of flat land near a creek about 6 miles from the closest gravel road. I parked my truck behind some brush at the edge of a logging trail and hiked in with my gear, rifle, tent, food, water, and enough supplies to last 4 or 5 days. The first day was peaceful. I set up my tent facing a rise in the land, so I had some cover from the wind. The creek babbled nearby, not too loud, and I could hear birds moving in the brush and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. I spotted a few deer trails and found a good tree stand spot I could use the next morning. After a simple dinner, jerky, instant coffee, and some bread, I settled in and listened to the woods until I fell asleep. The second day started early. I hiked up before dawn, climbed into the tree stand with my rifle, and waited in the cold. Around 7 a.m., I saw a buck move through the brush about 70 yards out, but the angle wasn't clean. I let him go. I wasn't desperate for meat. I just enjoyed the act of being out there, patient and alert. That evening, while hiking back to my tent, I noticed something strange. There was a deep print in the mud near the creek, larger than any boot I'd ever seen. At first, I thought maybe someone else had come through, maybe a logger or another hunter. But the tread was weird. It wasn't the kind of pattern you'd find on any regular hiking boot or work shoe. It almost looked homemade, like thick rubber with long, flat ridges. I crouched down and stared at it for a while, trying to figure out if maybe it was some kind of old boot print warped by the mud. But it was fresh. I could still see the moisture where the tread had pressed into the earth. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to some camper with strange gear, but it stuck in my head more than it should have. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The air had gotten colder, and there was a heavy silence in the forest. No crickets, no wind, just a dead stillness that made the trees feel like they were holding their breath. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, rifle close by, eyes open in the dark, staring at the thin outline of the tent roof above me. Around 2 a.m., I heard something move. It wasn't an animal scurrying through brush. It was heavier, slower, measured. Footsteps, maybe 30 yards out, near the tree line. They stopped after a few seconds. I sat up and listened, holding my breath. Nothing. Then a faint splash, just one in the creek. Then nothing again. I stayed awake until sunrise, not moving, not even unzipping the tent. I didn't want to scare myself into thinking it was a person, but something about those footsteps didn't sit right. In the morning, I walked down to the creek with my rifle slung over my shoulder and looked around. I didn't see anything unusual at first. Then, about 15 feet downstream from where I usually washed up, I saw more tracks. The same kind of print I'd seen the day before. This time there were two side by side, like someone had stood there for a while, facing the direction of my tent. I checked my gear, everything was untouched. No signs of animals, no signs of people, no broken branches, no scattered trash. Still, I packed up some of my extra food and hiked it halfway back to my truck, just in case I needed to leave in a hurry. I hid it in a hollowed log under some moss. That day, I didn't hunt. I just walked. I made a big loop around my camp, going wider than I usually would, checking for more signs of people or anything else. I didn't see anyone, but I did notice something strange. A tree about a mile from my camp had several deep scratches along its bark, low to the ground. Not claw marks, more like someone had dragged a blade across the surface in a pattern. 3 long cuts, horizontal and clean, about 6 inches apart. I touched the bark and it flaked slightly, like it had been carved a few days ago. By then, I was unsettled, but I didn't want to overreact. I stayed another night. I figured if someone was out there messing around, maybe they were just passing through. I kept my fire low and stayed in the tent with the rifle on my lap. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement again. This time it was closer. Slow crunches of dead pine needles. No animal I know moves like that. Too deliberate. Stopped just outside my tent, maybe 10 feet away. I could hear breathing, not loud, but just enough to make my heart freeze. Then nothing. Total silence for 5, maybe 10 minutes. I don't even remember how long I sat there not moving. Then, out of nowhere, a single light tap on the side of the tent. Just one, like a fingertip or a stick. I didn't react. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I just stayed absolutely still. I must have passed out from sheer adrenaline, because when I opened my eyes, the sun was already up. I opened the tent slowly, looked around. No one there. I walked the full perimeter of my camp. No footprints, nothing disturbed. But the print by the creek? Gone. Washed away or covered up. Maybe intentionally. I packed everything up. I didn't eat, didn't even stop for water. Just shoved my gear into the backpack, folded the tent, and started hiking out. My mind was racing, but I stayed alert, watching every branch and shadow. When I reached my truck, the cab door was unlocked. I was certain I'd locked it. Always did. I checked inside, nothing missing, but the glove compartment was open. Not rifled through, just hanging open. As if someone opened it and left it like that on purpose. I checked under the seats, in the bed, all around the truck. No footprints in the gravel, but the dust on the side window had been disturbed. 2 long streaks, like someone ran their fingers along the glass. I didn't even check the gear stash I'd left earlier. I just got in the truck and drove. I didn't tell anyone right away. It took weeks before I mentioned it to my cousin, and even then, I made it sound like a story I wasn't sure I believed myself. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. Someone or something was out there, not an animal, not a ghost, just a person. A real person with strange boots, no flashlight, and too much patience. Someone who wanted me to know they'd been watching. I never went back to that area again. I still hunt, but never alone, and never anywhere that far off trail. I don't think they wanted to hurt me, but they definitely wanted me to feel something, and I did. I still do. I went camping alone in the summer of 2013, just after my 27th birthday. I've been feeling boxed in lately, too much screen time at work, too much city noise. I lived in Sheffield back then and decided I wanted a break. I picked a quiet spot up near Northumberland, not far from Kielder Forest. I didn't want anything too touristy, just somewhere I could walk during the day and fall asleep to the sound of the wind through the trees. I had an old blue Berlingo van that I'd kitted out for sleeping in the back. Nothing fancy, just a foam mattress, blackout curtains, and a few shelves screwed into the wood panels. I also packed a tent, but I usually only used that if I stayed more than a couple nights. I checked the forecast before leaving. Dry, warm, a bit cloudy. Perfect. I set off on a Tuesday morning. Traffic was light. I stopped for petrol at a little place past Alnwick and then took a winding B road through endless stretches of quiet countryside, the sort of place where even the sheep look bored. I kept driving until the phone signal dropped to zero and the road thinned out into gravel. I parked in a clearing tucked between a stretch of pine trees and a slope of tall ferns. It wasn't an official campsite, just one of those old forestry access points that no one seemed to care about anymore. No signs, no fences, just silence. The nearest proper village was almost 10 miles away. The air was heavy with the smell of pine needles and moss. I walked a bit to check things out and found a narrow trail that snaked deeper into the woods. There were no tire tracks on the gravel, no litter either. It felt untouched. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, read for a while, then fell asleep with the van doors slightly cracked open for air. The stillness was unreal. No dogs barking, no engines, not even an owl. I remember thinking I hadn't felt that kind of quiet since I was a kid. The second day, I hiked along the trail I'd seen earlier. It led further than I expected, up a slow hill, then down into a thick patch of trees. After about 2 hours of walking, I came across something odd. An old wooden fence half buried in undergrowth, running in a jagged line across the woods. It looked like it had been there for decades. Some of the planks had rotted down to just a sliver. I figured it must have marked farmland a long time ago, before the trees grew in. I didn't think much of it at the time. I walked a bit further, then turned back before sunset. When I got back to the van, the sky was already turning pink. Everything looked the same, untouched. But I had this weird feeling in my chest like something had shifted. It wasn't fear exactly, just that low, uneasy pressure you get when something isn't quite right but you can't name it. That night, I slept with the back doors locked. Not because anything had happened, just instinct, the kind you don't argue with. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The van was cold and completely dark. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, faint crunching. Not animals rustling leaves, but the slow, careful sound of someone walking on gravel. 1 foot at a time, trying not to be heard. I didn't move. My heart was thudding, loud enough I was sure it could be heard outside. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time circling the van. I couldn't see anything through the blackout curtains, but I could hear the sound of shoes. Definitely shoes, brushing gravel and sticks. Then they stopped again, right behind the van. I stayed frozen for what felt like 10 full minutes. Then silence. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I got out to look. No one was there, of course, but there were fresh marks in the gravel. Not clear prints, just the kind of disturbance that suggested someone had been walking slowly around. I told myself it was probably a local farmer or someone out on a weird early walk. But deep down, I didn't buy it. There were no nearby houses, no gates, no reason for someone to be there at 3 in the morning. Still, I stayed another night. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to be scared off. Maybe I thought if I just ignored it, it'd be fine. That third night was worse. I didn't sleep at all. I kept my torch within arm's reach and had my boots on, just in case. Around midnight, I heard a twig snap outside, then again, then footsteps, slower this time, almost deliberate. They came from the direction of the trail I'd walked earlier. I kept the lights off. I didn't move. Then something tapped the side of the van. Not hard, just a single light tap like a finger, then nothing. I didn't hear anything after that, but I couldn't relax. I just lay there in the dark, straining to hear even the smallest sound. At dawn, I opened the back doors slowly, bracing for something, anything, but there was no one. I scanned the woods, still no movement. I walked a short distance toward the trail and found something on the ground that made my stomach sink. An old thermos. It wasn't mine. It was dented and scratched, with moss growing around its base. It had clearly been there a while, maybe years, but that wasn't what got me. What got me was that it was propped against the base of a tree about 50 feet from where I'd parked. And on its side, someone had scratched something faint with a blade or a key. Stay quiet. I didn't waste time packing. I threw everything into the van, didn't even fold the stove or close the food containers. I just left. As I reversed onto the gravel road, I glanced at the tree line. That's when I saw him, a man standing just beyond the ferns, partially hidden by the trees. He was tall, thin, in dark clothes. I couldn't make out his face, but I could tell he was staring at the van. Not waving, not moving, just staring. I hit the accelerator and didn't stop until I was back on the A68. Once I had signal, I pulled over and called the non-emergency police line. I told them what I'd seen and where. They were polite, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. Just told me to avoid isolated areas and to report anything suspicious if it happened again. I didn't go back. Weeks later, I was still thinking about it. Not every day, but it stayed with me in flashes. Walking around the van in the dark, the soft tapping on the side, the message on the thermos. I looked up missing persons in the area, found a few old reports, but nothing that lined up. No break-ins, no attacks, just quiet woods. But it wasn't empty. Someone had been out there watching, waiting. It's been over 10 years now. I still camp, but never alone, and never in places without signal. Sometimes late at night, I think about that man in the woods. I wonder how long he'd been out there. I wonder how many others saw him, and I wonder how many didn't. I was 35 the year I decided to take time off from work and drive up to northern Idaho alone. It was late September 2014, and I had been working long weeks at a factory job in Oregon. The kind of job where every day feels the same: metal, noise, sweat, repeat. I needed a break, not just for my body, but for my mind. I didn't want crowds, hotels, or busy campsites. I wanted silence. I wanted to wake up in the cold, step outside a tent, and not hear anything except the wind in the trees. I found a spot on an old map I bought from a gas station just before crossing into Idaho. It was a small, unmarked turnout along a gravel forest road deep in the Clearwater National Forest. No official campground, just open national forest land with miles of pine trees and dirt tracks. The kind of place you don't find by accident. You'd never think to stop there unless you were looking to disappear for a while. The road up was rough and slow. I had an old Toyota 4Runner, packed with a heavy-duty tent, enough canned food and water for 4 days, my .357 revolver just in case, and a cheap folding table I'd borrowed from my cousin. By the time I found the place and set up, it was close to evening. The sky had turned that burnt orange color that only shows up in the mountains right before the sun dips. The first night was quiet. I had a fire going. I ate beef stew from a can and drank instant coffee, even though it was too late for it. I sat there staring into the flames with the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. That night, I slept harder than I had in a long time. The kind of sleep that wraps around you and holds you in place. I didn't even hear the usual night sounds, no owls, no rustling, nothing. Just whined through the trees. The second day, I walked deeper into the woods. I didn't bring a phone or a GPS, just a compass, my revolver, and a paper map. I followed an old animal trail that led uphill through thick brush and over a dried creek bed. The forest was dense but not wild. You could tell someone had logged it years ago. There were old stumps with faded pink ribbons still tied to them. I saw some deer tracks and a few small piles of scat, probably elk or moose. I was looking for a good place to maybe spot some wildlife the next morning, but I didn't go too far. I wasn't trying to get lost. When I came back to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something small that stuck with me. My folding chair had been moved. I had left it right next to the fire ring, but now it was off to the side, closer to the tree line. I figured maybe wind had caught it, or maybe I hadn't paid attention when I set it down the night before. I brushed it off. I didn't want to think too much, but that night I woke up. It was still dark, though I could see a faint outline of the trees through the tent's mesh ceiling. There wasn't a sound. No bugs, no breeze, not even the usual creaking of trees swaying. Just a heavy stillness that pressed against my ears. I don't know what woke me up. No noise, no movement. Just an off feeling, like I'd been underwater and something above had shifted. I sat up slowly, unzipped the sleeping bag halfway, and reached for the revolver I kept next to my bedroll. I held it in my lap for a long while, just listening. Nothing, but the kind of nothing that felt wrong. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being jumpy. I lay back down, hands still wrapped around the grip of the gun, and closed my eyes. I must have drifted off eventually. When I stepped outside the next morning, there were boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. Mine had deep treads from my work boots. These were smoother, flatter, maybe some kind of hiking shoe or sneaker. The prints came in from the direction of the trees, circled my tent, paused right outside the flap, then walked back toward the brush. I just stood there for a long time staring at them. I didn't panic, but my stomach turned over. The prints weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old, but they were clear enough to know someone had been there while I slept. I walked the perimeter of the site. No sign of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but my firewood had been moved, stacked differently. My water jug had been nudged, like someone had picked it up and set it down. That whole day I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't leave camp. I kept my revolver holstered on my hip and checked it every 30 minutes. I even strung up a basic tripwire using fishing line and bottle caps around my tent that night. It was crude, but enough to alert me. The forest stayed silent again that night. Not peaceful like the first night, just mute. I didn't sleep. I sat up in the tent, back against the wall, gun in hand, eyes open. Hours passed. My watch said 3:17 a.m. when I finally blinked longer than I meant to and fell asleep for real. In the morning, 3 of the bottle caps were gone. No sound.
No alert.
Nothing had woken me, but someone had been close enough, careful enough, to undo part of the line without triggering it. I found 2 of the caps near the tree line. The third was gone. That was when I knew someone was watching me, not just passing by. Not a hiker. They'd come back and they were playing with me, testing things. I didn't waste time packing up. I shoved everything into the 4Runner, barely folded the tent, and peeled out of that clearing before the sun had fully risen. I didn't care about breakfast or trash. I just drove. Fast. 30 miles of rough gravel road felt like it took hours. Every bend, every slow curve made me expect to see someone standing in the road. I made it to the nearest town, a place called Pierce. Just a few buildings, a gas station, a diner. I parked in front of a laundromat and sat in the driver's seat for a long time with the doors locked and the windows up. I watched every car, every person walking past. I knew no one was following me, but it didn't matter. My nerves were fried. I was done. A week later, back home, I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe the footprints were old and I was reading too much into it. Maybe I'd messed up the tripwire myself. But the facts didn't go away. The prints, the rearranged things, the missing bottle cap. The feeling of being studied like prey. It's been years since that trip, and I've never gone camping alone again. I still camp, sure, but only in well-marked spots with people with cell service. I never leave gear out. I never leave food where it can be moved. And I don't sleep without something close at hand. The woods used to be peaceful, but after that trip, I understood something I hadn't before. Out there, in the deep forest, you're not as alone as you think. And the people who choose to hide out there, away from roads and rules, they're not always looking to be left alone. Sometimes they're looking for someone who won't be missed. And I was almost that someone. It was early October 2013, and I was working as a field technician for a small surveying company based out of Bozeman, Montana. The guy who ran the company, Rob Callahan, was in his mid-40s. Shaved head, wiry frame, always chewing gum. And he had this habit of dragging employees out on these working retreats. It sounded innocent enough. A weekend away from the office, hiking, camping, reviewing maps. But in reality, it was just a way for Rob to get cheap labor in remote areas under the cover of a team building trip. I was 27 at the time and still pretty new at the company. So when Rob invited me on one of these trips to scout a plot of forest land east of the crazy mountains, I couldn't say no. We left on a Thursday morning in his old silver Tacoma, loaded with camping gear, topo maps, a cooler full of sandwiches and beer, and 2 rifles. His idea of safety in case we ran into bears. The drive was long and winding, 2-lane highways that cut through plains and forest, until eventually the road gave way to dirt. We drove for what felt like hours on that narrow forest road, climbing higher into the woods, until there was no reception on either of our phones. Just us, the trees, and the hum of the truck engine. We pulled off into a clearing around 4 in the afternoon. There was an old logging trail that ran north from the clearing, and that's where Rob said we'd be heading the next day. The goal was to mark off GPS coordinates for a client who was considering buying the land for a hunting lodge. We set up camp right there in the clearing, 2 tents, fire pit, some folding chairs. The air was crisp, sharp with the smell of pine and damp leaves, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of wind in the branches and the faint creaking of old trees. That night, we cooked some canned chili on a small propane stove and sat by the fire drinking beer while Rob droned on about past jobs. I barely paid attention. I just kept looking out past the trees, past the flickering firelight into the pitch-black woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to being too far from civilization and tried to ignore it. The next morning, we geared up and followed the old trail north into the woods. We hiked for most of the day, stopping now and then to take GPS readings and mark trees with pink ribbon. The forest was thick and quiet, with towering spruce and dense undergrowth. Around mid-afternoon, we came across a dried creek bed littered with animal bones. Deer, maybe an elk, and Rob decided it was a good place to set a waypoint. We returned to camp just as the sun was going down. The woods around us looked different in that light, darker, more closed in. I remember clearly how the air felt colder, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in just an hour. I started gathering kindling, and that's when I noticed something strange. One of the pink survey ribbons we'd tied was wrapped around a tree near camp, but we hadn't marked any trees that close to the clearing. I asked Rob if he remembered putting it there, and he just shrugged, said maybe it was from a previous team. I didn't push it, but it stayed in the back of my mind all night. That night was worse than the last. Couldn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft crackle of the dying fire and the distant hoots of owls. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard something outside the tent. It wasn't an animal moving through the brush. Too slow, too deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was a soft crunch like a footstep on dry pine needles. Then another. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like an hour, heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the tent walls. I told myself it was Rob taking a leak. That's all. But in the morning, when I asked if he'd gone out in the night, he shook his head and said he'd slept straight through. I didn't mention what I'd heard. I didn't want to look paranoid. We packed up our gear and set off again to map the far edge of the property. We were deep into the woods when Rob stopped suddenly. He bent down and picked something up from the ground. It was a bullet casing, fresh, clean, not corroded by rain or time. He looked around, his jaw tight, then tossed it aside without saying anything. A few minutes later, we found a small pile of trash, empty protein bar wrappers, a half-burned cigarette. Someone had been camping out here, and recently, we finished the day's work and returned to camp in silence. That night, Rob stayed up late by the fire, staring into the flames, the rifle across his lap. I went into my tent, exhausted but too wired to sleep. The woods were quiet again, but not in a peaceful way. More like the calm before a storm. The fire outside slowly died out, and darkness swallowed the camp. Then, just before dawn, I heard something. It started as a faint metallic clatter, like a tin can being kicked, then a low scraping sound. I sat up, unzipped my tent just a crack, and looked out. The fire pit was cold. The chairs were empty. Rob's tent was zipped shut, but someone or something was standing just beyond the tree-line. I could barely make out the shape. Too big to be a deer. It didn't move, just stood there. I stayed still, watching, until finally the figure turned and slipped back into the woods without a sound. When the sun came up, I got out and saw fresh prints in the dirt.
Boot prints.
Deep ones, like whoever it was had been standing there a long time. I pointed them out to Rob. He said nothing, just nodded, packed up his tent, and told me to get moving. We didn't eat breakfast, didn't talk, just loaded up the truck and drove out of there fast. On the way back, we passed a rusted hunting shack a few miles down the dirt road. Something about it felt off. The door was open. Inside, it looked like someone had been living there recently. Blankets, cans of food, torn clothes. Rob stopped for a moment, stared at it, then got back in the truck and kept driving without a word. We didn't file the report on the client's property. A week later, Rob told me he'd dropped the contract, said the client lost interest. But I don't think that's what happened. I didn't push it. A few months later, I left the company and moved back to Missoula. I never went camping again. I still think about those 3 days, especially the figure by the tree-line, the bullet casing, the trash, the boot prints. Someone else was out there, and they knew exactly where we were. It was October 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the desert outside Page, Arizona. I had just turned 30 a few months earlier, and something in me was itching to be far from people, noise, and phones. I wanted a few nights where all I could hear was the wind moving across dry ground and maybe the distant call of coyotes. I'd always liked that kind of emptiness. Open desert with just cliffs, dry grass, and the big sky overhead. I brought enough gear for 4 nights, packed it all in my old Toyota 4Runner, and took off on a Wednesday morning. The spot I picked wasn't part of a campground. It wasn't even on a trail. I had studied some satellite maps, marked a dirt track that split from Highway 89, and followed it out past the power lines and ranch fencing until I saw nothing but rocks and red sand. I drove another mile or 2 off the main dirt road, bouncing slow over the rough ground until I reached a wide, flat area surrounded by buttes. I parked near a rock outcrop to shield the truck from the wind and set up camp maybe 50 yards away. There was no cell signal, no lights, no fences, just total quiet. The first day passed the way I'd hoped. I walked around in the dry heat, cracked open a few beers as the sun dropped, and watched the whole desert turn orange and then blue. That kind of sunset always looks like the land is on fire. I made a small fire of driftwood I'd collected, cooked some beans in a tin, and crawled into my tent before the stars were even fully out. The desert has a silence that presses down on you. It's thick, but peaceful. It was sometime during that second night that I heard something outside the tent. Not just wind or shifting sand, but something with weight. The kind of noise that makes you sit up real slow. It wasn't close, just outside the range of the firelight, but it was steady. A dragging kind of step, like something walking on two legs, but not smooth, not normal. I stayed still for a long time and listened. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move, just listened until it faded away. The next morning I found prints. Not boot prints, not paw prints either. Something strange. Long toes, wide pad, but too narrow to be a bear or cougar. The stride was long, too far longer than mine. The prints circled the camp once and veered off toward the rocks to the north. I looked for a while and then covered them up with sand. I didn't want to see them again, honestly. I tried to push it out of my head that day. I went hiking up into one of the nearby canyons and found a dry stream bed that led down into a narrow pass. The air was dry and dead still. I didn't see any animals all day, not even a lizard. When I got back to the camp in the afternoon, everything was exactly as I'd left it, but I felt different. I couldn't say why, but I felt like I was being watched. The sun was still up, but I started the fire early. I didn't eat much. I sat by the flames until the wind picked up, then zipped myself in the tent without turning on my lantern. I didn't want to attract anything. I didn't even read like I usually did. I just laid there in the dark. I must have dozed off because I remember waking up to the sound of breathing. Not mine, something outside. It was slow and shallow, like it didn't want to be heard, but it was right near the back of the tent. I could hear the thin nylon shifting under the weight of whatever was leaning against it. I didn't move. I held my breath and stared up at the roof of the tent, heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard the zipper twitch, just a little. It didn't open, but it moved. Something tugged it gently, just enough to test it. Then the breathing stopped, and I heard nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed frozen until daylight. When I stepped outside, the fire had burned out. The air was cold and still, but nothing looked disturbed. I didn't see any prints this time, not even mine from the day before. It was like the desert had wiped everything clean overnight. That spooked me more than anything. I didn't talk, didn't even hum as I packed up some of my gear and tossed it back into the truck. I left the tent standing just in case I stayed one more night, but I already knew I wasn't going to. I left on foot around noon to explore one more canyon to the west. It was narrower than the others, with tall cliffs that rose on both sides. I followed the bottom path for almost an hour and was about to turn back when I saw something ahead on a ledge. It looked like a man at first, tall, thin, arms too long for the body. But the way it stood, stiff and crooked, wasn't right. I thought maybe it was a dead tree at a weird angle or a shadow. But then it moved. It didn't step. It slid. I froze. Every instinct I had told me not to move. It was maybe 100 feet away, high up, just watching. I could make out dark skin, mottled, maybe dirty or cracked. Its face, if it had a face, was sunken and long like an animal skull. The arms hung low, way too low. I didn't wait. I turned around and walked fast, then ran, back through the canyon, stumbling over rocks, scraping my hands. I didn't stop until I reached my camp and saw my truck still there, untouched. That was enough. I tore down the tent without folding it. I shoved everything into the back of the 4Runner and took off, driving fast over the rocky trail, scraping the bottom of the truck more than once. I didn't care. I just kept looking in the mirrors. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and I didn't stop again until I was back in Flagstaff, checked into a motel off the highway. I stayed in the room for 2 days. I kept the lights on and the curtains shut. My hands were shaking, even when I tried to eat. I told myself maybe it was some guy out there, maybe someone living rough, maybe hallucination from dehydration, though I knew that wasn't true. I'd had enough water, and what I saw wasn't something you imagine. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something between, something stretched out and worn thin, like skin pulled over the wrong bones. A week later, I went back for the rest of my gear. I didn't go alone. I brought a friend from work, didn't tell him everything, just said I'd had a scare. We drove out during daylight, packed everything up in 20 minutes, and left. The place felt different, even in the sun. The stillness wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the silence was watching us. I haven't camped alone since then. I still get out into nature sometimes, but not way out like that. Not off-grid, and not in Arizona. I still don't know what I saw out there, but I know what I felt. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a dream. It was something real, something older than stories, something that knew how to be quiet, how to study people, something that waits. And I think it wanted to wear me,